All right, let's start this again. I'm David Martin from Argonne National Lab. I'd like to welcome you to our opening session. First, I'd like to thank Advanced Micro Devices for sponsoring this session. And then I'd like to introduce our great speaker. Andrew Siegel is a professor at the University of Chicago. He's a senior scientist at Argonne National Laboratory. But for the purpose of this talk, he is the area director for application development at the Exascale computing project, and he's going to share some of his experiences. I want to remind you that there are the ability to ask questions in the chat box, and I will be asking those at the end. Andrew's talk will last about 30 minutes. We'll have about 5 minutes for discussion. So I'd like to introduce Andrew to talk about recent experiences in porting complex applications to accelerator-based systems. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you very much, David. Let me do a sound check, and can you hear me? Let's see, sound check.
You sound good.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we're at this point 2/3 of the way into the Exascale computing project, which I'll describe in detail shortly. And in this talk, I'll update you on how things have gone generally in the project, what's been harder than expected, what's gone surprisingly well, what remains to be done, and then finally some implications for the future. So before we begin, let me start by posing some fundamental questions that might be on your minds during the talk. And it's very important for me to remember that not everybody is operating at the bleeding edge of high performance computing, and that most of what happens is at a sort of mid-range. And it's important to think about the implications of the things we're doing in the project for people who are doing procurements to solve very practical problems on mid-size or even large sort of mid-range compute systems. So I might not address the answers to all these questions specifically, and they certainly depend on everybody's circumstances, but hopefully many of the experiences I relate will provide some perspective for at least how to think about them. So one question is, to what degree will this initial US exascale technology impact what people see at mid-range high-performance computing? And is this inevitable, or might we not see such an impact? What are viable alternatives for people making procurements in the next several years? I talked to lots of different groups who wonder, is it time to buy, for example, a GPU-based system now? Should I wait? What are the implications of waiting? And how do I make this decision? And what about alternatives to the technologies that we'll see have been chosen by the US for their first push to exascale? For example, the RMFP64 system in Fugaku. How long will these architectures be relevant? So what is next after what we see in this first wave of exascale, and how will these systems evolve, and how long will that last? And is it reasonable to sort of stand on the sidelines and take a wait and see approach? And related to that is, what is the cost of porting? And that includes complexities in portability across multiple GPU vendors, strategies for incremental migration to GPUs that don't require massive software overhauls to get correctness in initial results, the status of legacy code, things, for example, the Fortran language, and something closely related, which is the maturity of the system software and the application level libraries. So what I show here on the right is the fraction of the total top 500 list that is includes accelerator-based systems, and as you see, most of those at this point are NVIDIA-based systems, but it's a substantial portion. And currently, what we see even at the bleeding edge is having an impact far down the list in terms of the types of systems people are purchasing. So first, let me convey a few things about the size and scope of ECP with some simple numbers, and then we'll dive into details of porting experiences. So first, ECP, the Exascale Computing Project, has been executing since 2016. It's actually, as this pie depicts, part of a broader initiative called the Exascale Computing Initiative. And the Exascale Computing Initiative has three main parts to it, and there are two that are particularly relevant for what I'm talking about. One, which is grayed out, are the system procurements. So they're the actual 3 exascale systems, which I'll highlight in just a moment, that are purchased in the United States: the Frontier system, the Aurora system, and the El Capitan system. And it also includes the Exascale Computing Project, which is what I'm talking about today. And this overall constitutes 4 large formal Department of Energy projects. And obviously, the ECP is critically dependent on these procurement projects to succeed. They're on our formal path, and we work very closely with them. We focused very hard in ECP to quantify the goal of an enduring and capable exascale computing system. I'll talk about that throughout the talk. And our success within this project is measured in a quantifiable way and rigorously judged by 4 so-called key performance parameters. Okay, so a few more figures just to get a sense of the scope of ECP. It's a 7-year project. It's a $1.8 billion investment in research and development to get and deployment, I would say also. That started in 2016. There are 6 core Department of Energy labs that are involved, and I have them listed here, but there are researchers really from all 17 at any one time, at least, all 17 Department of Energy national laboratories. And it includes 6 high-performance computing vendors who participated in the underlying research and development for the exascale systems as part of a program called Path Forward. There are 3 major technical focus areas in ECP: hardware and integration, which relates to the procurement, integration with the facilities projects, software technology, and then application development. So I highlight application development because that's what I'm focusing on here, and that's what I lead. And just to get a sense of scope, there are 81 research teams total across ECP. Team sizes are roughly 10 researchers on average. That amounts to something like 1,000 total researchers, and hundreds of impactful, consequential milestones have been delivered, largely on schedule, not perfectly, of course, and largely on budget, obviously not perfectly, since project inception. But as a project, these things are carefully quantified and tracked, even within an R&D environment. So I mentioned exascale systems. Now let me be a little more specific, and here I show the recent history, the present, and the near-term future of DOE HPC systems. So as I mentioned, we started in 2016, and the systems that existed at the time, which were sort of our baseline systems, were of the order of 10 to 20 petaflop peak theoretical systems. They might be accelerator-based. In one case, we had GPU accelerators, or they might be clusters of Xeons. But we moved quickly in 2018 to the summit in the Sierra architecture, which were multi-GPU based. But in all cases, if you notice, up to this point in the project, we're obviously just into 2021 now, all of the accelerator-based systems were NVIDIA-based. Okay, and we learned in the middle of the project that the exascale procurements were going to include AMD GPUs, Intel GPUs, and we have the Promoto system, which is not officially an exascale system, but which will be very important for this project, our NVIDIA system. So we moved to a diversity of GPU vendors. Obviously, that had a significant impact on our priorities, our timelines, our challenges. We consider it a very, very good thing, this diversity, but it has made the project more challenging in different ways. And right now we're, as you see, approaching what nominally on this chart shows the early exascale test systems. So I want to talk about, I should mention explicitly the diversity of GPUs. So I want to talk a little about the AD focus area, and I'll start by mentioning where we started with this project. So obviously there's a very broad portfolio of mission critical modeling and simulation in DOE, and it covers a huge range of areas. And here I've binned them in a particular way, and I highlight some of the interesting things, whether it's nuclear reactor simulation or fusion-based systems or fundamental material design and computational chemistry or light source imaging, metagenomics, whatever the case might be. There's a huge range of different things. And obviously not all of them could be supported in this push to exascale. So we were looking for a certain number of guinea pigs who were willing to sort of work on the cutting edge and take a risk and help both understand how to use these systems, do science on these systems, as well as contribute to the maturation of the systems at the same time. So there was a difficult RFP process, you can imagine, but in the end, 24 applications were chosen to be part of this push, and we see them as kind of leading the way into the exascale era for the other applications. Obviously, there are many, many more that are watching, that are collaborating, that are learning, and that are just behind, or in some cases on their own, are sort of part of it outside of this project. So this included, I say, 6 co-design projects. I'll talk about that in more detail, but these are sort of computational infrastructure that is cross-cutting across the applications that helps them do rapid development on these systems. And co-design is a very general term, so it's not obvious what it means, and I'll describe it in a little bit. So this included 78 codes. Over 10 million lines of code were represented. One thing that was very critical was that many of these codes supported, at least in our field, what we consider to be large user communities. So it might be up to 10,000 people or so if we're thinking about computational chemistry, but it could easily be in the hundreds for other applications. Molecular dynamics could be a lot. Astrophysics could still be 100 research teams. Computational fluid dynamics could be more. So that obviously impacts the degree to which we can eviscerate these codes without thinking about supporting the people who are using them to do science today. Obviously covered a broad range of mission critical science and engineering domains. That was the idea, to get coverage across this area that was relatively complete. And most started as just MPI codes in 2016, or MPI plus OpenMP for on-node threading. And if there were any GPU ports, they would be a piece of the code, maybe for a single GPU. Maybe there are some exceptions, but that was sort of the basic story going into it. Now, where are we at this point in the project? Well, all of the 24 applications I mentioned have gone through the following transition through a lot of work and a lot of research. I think of it more as scaling in than scaling up, because next generation systems have modest node counts compared to what you're used to, but the fine-grained parallelism exists on the node itself. So they've gone from this sort of CPU or CPU, multi-threaded CPU, to CPU plus single GPU, to CPU working with multiple GPUs, which brings in new challenges, to diverse multi-GPU architectures. And that includes early hardware that we have access to from Intel, AMD, and the new NVIDIA hardware. And it also includes new hardware features that are targeting AI workflows, but which can also be used more generally in creative ways to accomplish computational science. All projects have ported to the Summit or Sierra architecture, which were the architectures I showed in the middle of that slide. And they have performance increases, which is quantified by fairly complex figures of merit that are unique to each of these applications, between a factor of 20 and a factor of 300. So our successes on the Summit platform have been a major story of the project. And that's a different talk, but I'll mention that everyone's running on these systems and everyone is performing a huge range of results, but everyone's performing far better than I would have expected. The teams are working on porting and co-design and performance analysis with early Exascale hardware, so the hardware that is the precursor to the true Exascale systems. The teams have de facto become guinea pigs for exercising performance portable programming models. So how are you going to program these systems? I will talk shortly about a huge range of different possibilities, but as this ecosystem hardens, the application push is a big component of it. And the teams have had to sign up to work with technologies that are evolving, that are immature, to give feedback, to help mature them, and so forth. That's become a major theme. And finally, this co-design infrastructure for rapid deployment and prototyping of applications has turned out to be far more successful than we would have imagined. And I'll talk about that shortly. Now, let me say explicitly what the AD mission is in ECP and make some general observations about porting. So our goal is very simple in AD. I'm switching to just AD in particular, and that's to ensure that the Exascale hardware impacts the DOE science and engineering mission shortly after deployment, at the point of deployment, ideally. And that requires a significant, unprecedented investment in scientific applications, as you saw, far in advance of the Exascale machines. And one thing that we learned that was a surprise to me, and that I can't emphasize enough in trying to get people to understand what's going on in the project, is that there's really a hierarchy of porting approaches that touches all aspects of simulation. So we think of code porting as maybe reordering loops or changing data structures or memory coalescing, whatever the case might be. But we also have things that are more fundamental algorithmic restructuring that could include things like communication avoiding algorithms, reduced synchronization, or use of specialized hardware. And then we think of alternate discretizations, like approaching a problem using higher order methods because they have higher computational, higher arithmetic intensity, which are more amenable to the hardware. Then we think of just entirely new physical models. Like, I have all this new computing power, I have a lot of things I would like to model better, I'm going to choose the one that best fits the hardware. So it's sort of an interesting consequence of this big shift in computing hardware, is that the hardware has had a significant impact on all aspects of simulation strategy. And it's been, in most cases, difficult to simply port the same approach and take full advantage of the accelerator-based systems. Okay, and there's one other way to look at this that is important. I'll keep everything the same, but I'll mention that there are also a hierarchy of optimization approaches that go on in the project, and they go on simultaneously, and this is what makes it so complex. There are optimization approaches that are totally hardware dependent. I might show you an example or two shortly. So just algorithmic complexity on fictitious hardware. Okay, there are optimizations that target accelerators in general. There are optimizations that target multi-GPU systems, and then there are optimizations that are specific to the systems that we want to target. And at each stage, we get closer and closer to the peak theoretical performance that the application can get on a particular piece of hardware. But these are all mixed together and happening at the same time. And it's one thing that makes the project interesting and also very complex. So let me talk about approaches to getting good performance on exascale systems. And let me say something general about the state of programming models on these systems. Oh, I'm sorry, first I wanted to, a little confused here. So, all right, approaches porting exascale systems. So I talk about these three broad classes of areas. The code porting, adapting numerics, and adapting models. I collapsed them into three for simplicity. And I mentioned these as I was talking. I wanted to give a little bit more sense about how efficiently using the GPUs goes far beyond typical code porting. So when we think of porting code, we think of sort of these strategies that incrementally get you more and more performance on systems like GPU-based systems. When we think of numerics, we might think of things like communication avoiding sparse linear solvers. When we think of models, we might think of going from a deterministic to a stochastic model to exploit more parallelism. We might think about, like I said, prioritizing something that maps well to the GPU architecture. We might think about recomputing things that we used to look up, but the efficient use of GPUs involves all of these areas. And I want to talk a little bit about porting code just to give a sense of the level of complexity. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic about this. It's more interesting things that you have to think about when you do these type of ports. Not all of them are relevant to everybody, obviously, but they're lessons that I've learned in overseeing these projects for 5 or 6 years now. So the first is that one has to be able to extract massive parallelism from the algorithm. That goes without saying, but sometimes we lose a sense of how massive is. And if we just think about Summit, to literally map everything to all available parallelism would be 73 million degrees of parallelism. And that does not account for the need to oversubscribe to a GPU type architecture so that it can schedule efficiently. So you can imagine how going into future systems, billion-way parallelism is a starting point for being able to get efficient use out of those systems. High arithmetic intensity, that's true on CPUs as well, but it gets even more true on GPUs. So that's why people think about algorithmic changes that they can amortize the cost of through reuse of data that's near the processor. Another consideration that came up again and again at the beginning was not all applications have performance concentrations in a small fraction of the total application. So if you have flat performance challenging, because you normally have the CPU and you get these massive speedups, but not all applications look like that. And the ones that don't have had a longer trajectory to get to where they are now. We are in a scenario where we have high ratio of floating point operations available per byte of storage. Okay, and that's important just because oftentimes we've justified the need for the flops because we have bigger data footprints, right? And that data footprint could be data we're going to analyze or just grids or particles that we're going to simulate. So one has to think creatively about how to devise problems that take advantage of the architecture in that environment. There's a high value of n sub 1/2. That's an old term from vector architectures. But the idea is that strong scaling is more challenging, right? Because you need to have a larger problem on a GPU in order to get something close to the peak theoretical value of that GPU. People these days refer to it maybe as n sub 0.8, but it's the same idea. It's some measure of when you're able to efficiently use the majority of the resource. And if you take a fixed problem and scale it up, you thin out the work on each node, and you find the strong scaling dies out faster than it would have on a CPU. And so one has to think about the type of problems they want to solve and how one might mitigate that. Obviously, there are wide vectors which favor SIMD operations so that they don't have to branch. GPU residence has become a major theme. So it wasn't that way so much 4 or 5 years ago, but now almost all of the floating point operations are on the GPU. So we think of putting a computation on the GPU and keeping it there as long as possible before we have to do any communication with the host. The mapping of complex data structures has been a practical problem that is more complex than it seems. People these days like C++, they like nested data structures within data structures, and one has to, by hand, marshal and unmarshal these unless they can use some kind of global memory between the host and the GPU that does it automatically. But if not, then it can be a lot of work. And most people do not simply pass pointers to functions and operate on contiguous memory anymore. Bitwise reproducibility has been a problem. So GPU codes have to be able to execute correctly in any order of block scheduling. And that's probably fine in most cases, but if you need to demonstrate to some kind of, for example, licensing authority that a code can give you exactly what some reference code does, you have to, there are ways people have devised to do that, but that has become a consideration. And then, of course, the specialized hardware that isn't designed for a lot of the HPC workflows, but more and more of them that are focused on data and learning, how much more broadly can they be used? Okay. All right, so let me talk now about what are the programming, I'll point to the tensor cores as an example. So what are the programming model choices for exascale machines? And this is where it gets really interesting. I tried to draw this graph. I don't know if I succeeded or not, but it makes sense to me at least. So what am I showing here? Well, on the x-axis is programmer control. So as you move to the right, the programmer has more ability to express optimizations that take advantage of the hardware. And as you go up, the programmer is more productive and the code is potentially more portable. Okay. And so if we think of applications, applications are, the reason I have the graph drawn this way is that the applications employ multiple strategies and some strategies depend on other strategies. But one thing that's been really interesting in the project is a lot of our applications have preferred to work as much as possible, at least up in this region here. And what am I showing? Well, motif-based framework, this would be you're using an adaptive mesh framework library, finite element analysis, or particle and cell, one of these co-design centers where a team works with you to insulate you from a lot of the details of getting performance portably across multiple GPU systems. And you are dependent on someone else, but you also can be much more productive. In this case, you have languages, or I think of them as sort of programming models that are agnostic to the hardware, like Raja or Cocos or Oka are examples, that allow you to express your parallelism in a hardware agnostic way and run it on different GPUs or even CPUs. And you know, these are evolving projects, so how well they work, how long they'll be around, become risks. At the same time, you can port much more quickly and you can insulate yourself from the complex details of these architectures much more. And then we get down to things like OpenMP and OpenACC, which are directive-based standards, still fairly high level. And then the sort of native model of the machine like CUDA or HIP or Siegel, okay? And historically in HPC, people run to this area right here. In this project, we haven't seen that so much, and I'll try to quantify that on the next slide. So we do lots of surveys of what people are doing across all of these projects. One thing has been, and I don't feel great about this, but it's been the fleeing of Fortran. This was closer to 40% at the beginning. On nights and weekends, people kind of translate their code to C++. I would say that's more of accepting the reality that the Fortran tools aren't as mature when you're working on the cutting edge, not that the language didn't provide what they needed to be able to perform the simulations. But however you look at it, it's the reality of the project. It's changed a lot over time. And there's some Python driver stuff mixed in. We have a few application sort of non-standard kind of HPC data and sort of machine learning applications that are really just fascinating, and metagenomics and imaging from light sources and machine learning for cancer diagnosis and the power grid. But I won't talk about those, but there's some Python. These are a little Julia mixed in there. But this is sort of what I was talking about, right? If you look at across the projects, this is the first dependency of an application. So, you know, Cocos and Raja has back ends that might be Siegel or HIP or CUDA or whatever, but this is what the applications are using themselves. So a lot of loop pragma, and the question of how well these will work on GPUs is an open question, and it's become a critical question within the project. And the co-design libraries have been very popular. Okay, so let me just go through very quickly a few case studies to make some of these points more concrete. I understand this will be very fast, but let me say first an example of the compute system influencing modeling priorities. This is climate, and the goal is to move to higher resolution in climate modeling. Instead of increasing global resolution, they chose instead to maintain the same resolution, but to add a so-called superparameterization, which is a cloud resolving subgrid model. It's characterized by localized physics and high compute intensity, and it enabled them to do calculations at unprecedented fidelity that made efficient use of the GPU resources. And they've also been able to run faster and therefore longer, which, as I mentioned, strong scaling is difficult on GPUs. But what's interesting is they made this decision based off of, you know, it's an interesting modeling approach that they wanted to try, but also it looked very good on GPU type systems. This is an example of dedicated performance porting using a very diverse team of experts, which is a real theme in this project. It's called Exalt. It's molecular dynamics that's focusing both on large systems, but also long time scales using something called a replica-based method. And the team improved performance on Summit by a factor of 22 from their initial port to Summit, which itself was over 10 times faster than the previous generation of HPC systems, the ones I showed you at the beginning. And performance improvements come from a huge range of different sources. So this is a good example of the porting strategies that I showed you. And I depict them on the slide in the graph in the upper right. And it's in lots of algorithmic restructuring, lots of details of moving things around differently. And a good question will be moving to AMD and Intel GPUs will provide an important test, because this was all done through the Cocos higher level abstraction, working to do these improvements that I show on the right. And the question is, how will they carry over to other processors? So here is an example of improved numerical methods, sort of improving performance and the dependence of C++ abstraction layer that I talked about, Raja, for potential performance portability across GPUs. It's the EQ-SIM project, regional scale seismic hazard and risk assessment. And the goal is extreme scale modeling to understand ground motion structure interactions. So the Raja performance portability layer is used for efficient offloading to the GPU. And they built a curvilinear rather than a Cartesian mesh to do mesh refinement near the free surface to reduce the total number of grid points and time to solution. And they kept careful records of the performance improvements. So they combining both these algorithms and the new hardware, and they culminated so far as of last year in an FOM of over 60 on Summit. And they've moved to doing a lot of work on the pre-exascale systems at this point. They feel like they've gone pretty far on the Summit system. But anyhow, this is a very good exemplar of how these different approaches enabled good performance on these very complex projects. And I want to briefly explain the role of co-design centers, since it's something unique to this project, and the name is somewhat misleading, and it's also been successful beyond what we initially expected. So there are 6 of them, and each of them is centered around providing computational infrastructure around a motif or a theme that is either common in HPC, or we see it as will be common in the future. There's a forward-looking research component to this as well. So they are data analysis and reduction, block structure adaptive mesh refinement, discretizations around finite element methods, particle-based methods, graph algorithms, and machine learning. Okay, and I won't say a lot about it, but the Amrex Center is a great example of using these co-design motif-based libraries to accelerate adoption of Exascale. So 7 of the different application projects depend on the infrastructure built by Amrex. And again, the reason we say co-design is because it's not just a library you download and use. It requires, it has somewhat that flavor, but it requires working closely with the team to exploit what might be slightly unique about your project and to insulate you from the details of having to figure out how to run efficiently on our system. Okay, so let me mention our annual report because it will be available shortly. The 2019 annual report is available now. It is a collection for every single one of these applications, a very brief background of the application and where they are now in this project. And I think it's a fantastic collection of war stories and difficulties, challenges, and successes. And every year we assemble the report and we pull out some common themes. And the 2019 report, I looked at all the reviews from it and I read it, and a few of these things jumped out. And it was interesting. I won't mention them because that's old, because now we have the 2020 report, which I just sent to the director, Doug Cothe, for a final review. And it should be out at the end of the month. And it's interesting to see how the themes evolve. And this year, there was a lot of very interesting use of mixed precision and different floating point formats. There was a lot of clever strategies for mitigating the negative impacts of strong scaling with accelerator-based systems. A lot of issues with the maturity of the software ecosystem that HPC depends on the early access machines. So things like dense matrix operations, things that need to perform well, are they there yet? And when you think about running on one of these machines, you have to think about the maturity of everything around the hardware, not the hardware itself, really. The performance of OpenMP offload, which I mentioned, the strategies for GPU residence, and the role of unified virtual memory in achieving that. And a really interesting one that's begun to emerge is, as we've gotten more GPUs on the nodes, scaled in, and the nodes have become more and more complex, that increased cost relatively of internode communication has percolated as a serious issue. So MPI implementations now, which weren't really an issue at 10,000 nodes, now have to keep up with the incredible performance on a node. And people are starting to say that's what our real bottleneck is. And that was not the case until this point in the project. Okay. So if I go back to the original questions I started with and wrapping up, I do not have answers to these questions, but I'll say a few things. So much depends on your own circumstance. But if I say, to what degree is this technology going to impact mid-range computing, I'd say a significant impact is highly likely, and there's an impact already. Okay, what are there viable alternatives? Absolutely. There doesn't have to be a huge rush. x86 or ARM-based systems, with or without the special vector extensions, are certainly viable alternatives. I would say, learn about and reason about how one would take it, how one's code would map to these type of systems before you dive in head first. If you have, a lot of people probably listening have already, but I'm speaking to people who are sort of on the sidelines. And what's the role of ARM64? Well, it's obviously a very fascinating system. We have a lot to learn still about it. And one of the questions is, even if you can port more easily, what's the cost of porting performance relative to a multi-GPU system? I think understanding and evaluating codes vis-a-vis these architectures is important, even though it's perfectly reasonable to take a wait-and-see attitude if you're doing a procurement. And the software cost of porting, obviously can be very low if you have localized operations, high intensity. Most of your performance is in a very small part of your code, but it could be quite high when you're doing things that are not computationally intensive, when you have performance spread out all around your code, when you have very complex data structures. So one has to also remember that the things that I list below are all evolving, and they're still relatively immature, and they'll be much better soon. So we'll begin to coalesce around programming models. We will see a thinning of the number of options and a hardening of the best ones. We will have better. Yes.
We've got like 2 minutes left, so we might want to wrap up and get a few questions in.
You caught me on my last sentence, so that's
excellent.
Perfect. Okay. And so all of it will be much more mature and much better soon if one wants to sort of watch and cheer it on and dabble. That is certainly perfectly appropriate. So with that, I will happily take any questions. Thank you for your time and attention.
Fascinating, Andrew. Thanks. You packed a lot into a short presentation. I think you gave a lot of people things to think about as they march toward Exascale. One of the questions that came up was if you can kind of characterize the teams and the expertise that are needed to accomplish this. So
Yeah, that is the most important question, actually. And the teams are led by domain scientists in almost all cases. The domain scientist obviously understands the modeling problem, how it relates to validation and verification, the numerics. They don't understand, generally speaking, there's some exceptions if anyone's in the audience, but generally speaking, they do not understand anything close to all of the complexity of the hardware and the sort of hardware algorithm interface that's necessary to pull this off. So the teams themselves are hybrid, and they have people with expertise in applied math and computer science and in sort of software engineering on them. But they also, and this has been really important, work very closely with performance engineers who reside at the facilities. So these are the DOE computing facilities, and they have tuned many, many codes for the systems that they host over many years. And they're almost part of the team. Then they also work with a center of excellence supported by the vendors that has people who do have deep expertise on the vendor systems and programming models. So the ones that have been most successful have either put all of this together in a very diverse team, or they have kind of offloaded it to a separate team through a co-design center or through a high performance, one of these sort of abstraction layers to kind of do it for them. Okay, they're both models have existed. And the question is, how generalizable and robust is the latter model? It will get better, but we'll see. But there's a lot of diversity on the really successful teams, and that's a critical question. Yeah, go ahead, David. Sorry.
Cool. No, I think we're at the end of our time here. So
Okay.
you transmitted a lot of good stuff. I appreciate your time. You gave us a good start to the day. And I want to pass it along to Donnie Cooper for our next session.